The night everything changed. The night air was crisp as Officer Daniel Brooks drove through the outskirts of the city, the hum of his patrol car the only sound breaking the silence. The streetlights cast long shadows on the empty sidewalks, illuminating patches of cracked pavement and scattered autumn leaves. It was supposed to be a routine night, another shift where nothing happened, another few hours spent watching a city that felt emptier by the day. He barely listened to the dispatcher's voice crackling through the radio. Petty theft, domestic disturbances, traffic violations. The same routine calls, the same city slowly falling apart. Daniel sighed and adjusted his rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his tired face. The lines around his eyes had deepened over the years, his dark brown skin showing signs of exhaustion that sleep never seemed to cure. His once neatly trimmed beard was now slightly unkempt, a sign of his slipping care for appearances. His wedding ring was long gone, left behind in a drawer he never opened. His life had changed the day the fire took his daughter, Ava. 3 years had passed, but time had done little to heal the gaping wound left behind. There were still nights when he woke up expecting to hear her voice, calling for him from the next room, only to be met with silence. Just as he was about to turn back toward the station, a flash of movement in his peripheral vision made him sit up straighter. A black luxury sit-in, a Mercedes, sped past him, easily doing at least 20 miles over the limit. Daniel's instincts kicked in automatically. He flipped on his siren and lights, accelerating after the vehicle. At least this was something to break the monotony, something that still made sense in a world where everything else had fallen apart. The Mercedes slowed and veered onto the shoulder, its tires crunching against loose gravel. Daniel parked behind it, stepping out of his patrol car with practiced caution. His fingers rested lightly on the holster of his weapon as he approached. He had seen too many stops go wrong, and even the wealthiest drivers weren't immune to bad decisions. The driver, a well-dressed white man in his 50s, was already rolling down his window. His expensive suit and polished silver hair gleamed under the streetlights. He had the look of a man who believed rules didn't apply to him, the kind who would talk his way out of a ticket with money and connections. "License and registration," Daniel said, his voice steady, professional. The man sighed, clearly irritated, and reached for the glove compartment, but something else caught Daniel's attention. Movement, a figure in the backseat. His flashlight beam swept over the interior, landing on a young girl pressed against the far door, her hoodie pulled up around her face. But it wasn't the hoodie that made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. It wasn't the way she shrank back in fear, eyes wide with panic. It was her face, the scar on her chin. The same scar she had gotten when she fell off her bike at 7 years old. The same wide, frightened eyes that had looked up at him every morning before school. It couldn't be. It was impossible. And yet, "Ava," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the idling engine. The girl's breath hitched, her eyes locked onto his. Recognition. Pure, undeniable recognition. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. Before he could move, before he could process what was happening, the driver snapped his head around, his polished composure cracking for a split second. Then, without warning, the Mercedes engine roared to life. The tires screeched as the car lurched forward, spraying gravel as it sped off into the night. Daniel stumbled back, cursing as he sprinted for his patrol car. His hands fumbled with the radio as he threw himself into the driver's seat, adrenaline surging through his veins like wildfire. "This is Unit 247, in pursuit of a black Mercedes. Plate number. Damn it." His voice cracked as he peeled out after the fleeing vehicle. The city blurred past in streaks of yellow and white as he pushed his car to its limits, the sirens wailing in the stillness of the night. The sit-in's taillights glowed red in the distance, weaving through empty streets like a ghost trying to escape the past. Daniel gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. They turned onto a narrow back road, trees closing in on both sides like silent watchers in the dark. Daniel pressed the accelerator to the floor, but the Mercedes was faster, sleeker. He wasn't gaining ground. He was losing it. Then, gone. The red taillights vanished around a bend, swallowed by the night. When Daniel made the turn, the road ahead was empty. He slammed his palm against the steering wheel, his body trembling with frustration, with fear, with something deeper, something that clawed at the edges of his mind, whispering the unthinkable. She was alive. She had been there. His daughter. The daughter he had buried. The daughter he had mourned. The daughter who had been declared dead. And now she was gone again. The silence in the patrol car felt suffocating as Daniel sat there, his world unraveling all over again. The first drops of rain began to fall on the windshield, blurring the streetlights into indistinct halos of gold. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, his fingers gripping the wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. 3 years. 3 years of grieving, of sleepless nights, of endless guilt. And now he knew. He had buried an empty casket. And someone had stolen his daughter. Unraveling the lies. The rain had turned into a steady downpour by the time Daniel pulled into his driveway. His patrol car's engine groaned as he shut it off, leaving him in suffocating silence. The storm outside mirrored the chaos inside his mind. His hand still trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he replayed the night's events over and over in his head. Ava. It had been her. Not a look-alike. Not a hallucination conjured by grief. It had been his daughter. The same little girl he had spent 3 years mourning. The same child he had watched being lowered into a grave. Only now she was older, scared, and entrapped in the backseat of a speeding car. The thought sent waves of nausea rolling through his stomach. His fingers dug into his scalp as he leaned against the steering wheel, his forehead pressing against the cool leather. What the hell had happened that night? Daniel barely remembered walking up the steps of his house. The lock clicked beneath his shaking fingers, and the door swung open to the familiar yet hauntingly empty space of his living room. Everything was the same as he had left it. Neat, untouched, silent. Too silent. The framed photograph of Ava on the mantel seemed to mock him, her beaming face frozen in time, her braids perfectly neat, her school uniform pressed. His chest clenched as he picked up the frame, his calloused fingers tracing over the glass. Had she been out there all this time? Had she been calling for him, waiting for him to find her? A sharp, bitter exhale escaped his lips as he slammed the frame down and stalked toward his office. He needed answers. The rational part of his brain told him to wait, to think this through, to contact the department and let them handle it. But the part of him that had already buried his daughter once refused to listen. The case file sat in the back of his closet, buried under years of dust and forgotten grief. He dragged out the cardboard box labeled Brooks. Eva. Case #2847. The ink faded from time. His fingers trembled as he flipped open the file, scanning the old police reports with a fresh pair of eyes. It was all there. The cause of death listed as presumed deceased due to the intensity of the fire. The lack of physical remains attributed to the blaze's high temperatures. But now, those words felt wrong. Presumed deceased. Not confirmed. Not verified. Just presumed. Daniel's pulse quickened as he turned the pages, searching for something. Anything that had been overlooked. Then, buried beneath the reports, he found it. A sealed envelope. The police stamp was still intact, the date matching the night of the fire. How had he missed this before? His breath hitched as he tore it open. Inside was a witness statement, a handwritten account from a neighbor, Mrs. Helen Watson, dated the night of the fire. Daniel's hands tightened around the paper as he read the words aloud, his voice hoarse with disbelief. I saw a black SUV parked across the street an hour before the fire started. It just sat there, no lights on, the engine running. Then, minutes before the smoke started rising, I saw someone get inside and drive away. His heart slammed against his ribs. An SUV. That had never been in the official report. No follow-up, No mention of an investigation into the lead. Why? Why would the department dismiss something this critical? Unless. A cold chill ran down his spine. Unless someone wanted the case closed. Quickly. He raked his hands through his hair, his breaths coming faster. It made no sense. Who would have wanted Ava gone? And why stage a fire? Why go to such lengths to make it look like she was dead? It didn't matter. What mattered now was that Ava was alive. And someone had taken her. Daniel shoved the files back into the box and grabbed his keys. He needed to talk to Mrs. Watson. Now, the early morning sun barely pierced through the heavy clouds as Daniel pulled up to the small, weather-worn house on the outskirts of town. The white paint on the picket fence had long since started peeling, and the once vibrant garden now looked overgrown, but the familiar wind chimes still dangled by the porch, their gentle tinkling a stark contrast to the storm raging inside his mind. He knocked twice. Seconds later, the door cracked open, revealing Helen Watson, her silver hair pulled back into a loose bun. Her face, aged with time and wisdom, showed no surprise at the sight of him. "I was wondering when you'd come back," she said softly, her sharp eyes scanning his face with an intensity that made his breath catch. Daniel stepped inside, the scent of vanilla tea and old books wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. The house was filled with warm, muted light, photographs of family members covering the walls. A time capsule of memories. "I need to talk about the night of the fire," he said, his voice thick with urgency. Mrs. Watson pursed her lips, setting down her cup of tea with deliberate slowness. "I told them," she said, her voice laced with quiet anger. "I told them about the car. I told them I saw someone get in and leave. But they didn't listen." Daniel's chest tightened. Who didn't listen? Her eyes darkened. The police. The room fell silent. Daniel clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. He had spent years serving this city, upholding the law, believing in justice. But this felt like betrayal. "Did you see anything else?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Watson hesitated, her fingers twisting together in her lap. Then, finally, she nodded. "The driver," she said. "I only caught a glimpse, but—" She swallowed hard, as if the memory still unsettled her. He was wearing a police uniform. Daniel's entire body went rigid. No, it couldn't be. But deep down, something inside him had already suspected. The way the case had been closed so quickly, the missing evidence, the lack of investigation. Someone on the inside had helped cover this up. And that meant whoever had taken Ava had powerful connections. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears as he stood. His head was spinning, his thoughts a storm of anger, grief, and determination. If someone in the department had been involved, he couldn't trust anyone. Not his colleagues, not his superiors, no one. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He was going to find Ava. And this time, nothing was going to stop him. A system built to bury the truth. Daniel had spent over a decade wearing his badge with pride, believing in the system he had sworn to protect. But as he sat in his car outside the police station, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, he realized that belief had been a lie. Someone in the department had helped cover up his daughter's disappearance. Someone had erased her from existence, and someone had the power to keep it buried. His pulse pounded as he stared at the station's dull brick exterior, the fluorescent lights flickering above the entrance. It had always felt like home, a place of justice, of purpose. Now it felt like enemy territory. He didn't know who he could trust. Hell, it could be anyone. Captain Reynolds, the guys in homicide, even the desk sergeant he had passed 100 times with a casual nod. It could even be his own partner. The thought made his stomach churn. Ryan Hale. They had been partners for years, watched each other's backs through everything. Drug busts, shootings, high-speed chases. If there was one man in the world he thought he could trust, it was Ryan. And yet, something didn't sit right. Ryan had been there when Ava died. Ryan had been the first officer on the scene that night. Daniel's fingers clenched against the leather of his seat as memories surfaced, sharp and jarring. The smoke, the sirens, the chaos, and Ryan standing there, gripping Daniel's shoulders, holding him back as the flames swallowed his house. "She's gone, Dan. There's nothing you can do." But what if he had known? What if he had been part of it? The thought sent a surge of raw anger through Daniel's veins, but he forced himself to stay calm. No accusations, no rash decisions. "I need proof." He pulled in a steady breath and grabbed his badge from the dashboard before shoving the car door open. If he was going to find Ava, he had to play it smart. That meant going into the lion's den and pretending he wasn't already hunting the lion. The station was buzzing with its usual early morning chaos. Officers exchanged reports, phones rang incessantly, and somewhere in the back, a suspect was shouting at the top of his lungs. It was all so normal. It made Daniel's skin crawl. As he strode through the halls, every glance felt suspicious. Every nod from a colleague felt rehearsed. His badge felt heavier on his belt, like it no longer belonged there. He had spent years walking these halls with certainty, knowing he was on the right side of the law. But now he was walking through a building filled with ghosts wearing uniforms. Ryan was at his desk when Daniel approached. The man looked up, offering a lopsided smirk. "Man, you look like hell. You get any sleep?" Daniel forced himself to return the smirk, sitting on the edge of Ryan's desk. "You know me. Coffee and paranoia keep me going." Ryan chuckled, stretching back in his chair. "Ain't that the truth?" His eyes flickered with something unreadable, and Daniel hated that he now had to analyze every glance, every word. "You hear about that black Mercedes that blew through town last night?" Daniel asked, watching Ryan's reaction closely. "Pulled it over, and the guy took off on me. Looked like he had a kid in the backseat. Didn't get a good look before he vanished." Ryan's expression didn't change. "Yeah, could be anything, man. Probably some rich asshole trying to keep his side business off the books." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's what I thought. But get this, I checked the plate. No records, no registration, nothing in the system." Ryan stiffened, just barely, but Daniel caught it. "Could be a ghost plate," Ryan said smoothly, flipping through a file on his desk like he wasn't suddenly uncomfortable. "Happened all the time with high-end criminals. Cars with white IDs. Some of those foreign dealers love that shit." "Sure," Daniel said. He kept his tone casual, but his gut was screaming. Ryan knew something. A tense silence settled between them. Then Ryan closed the file in front of him and leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "You doing okay, Dan? Because, look, I get it. Some nights you start seeing things that aren't there. You've been thinking about Ava a lot lately." The words sliced through Daniel like a knife. He forced his expression into a blank mask, but inside, his rage boiled. "He's trying to gaslight me. Trying to make me doubt what I saw." Daniel plastered on a tired grin. "You know me, man. Always seeing ghosts." He pushed off the desk and clapped Ryan on the shoulder, feeling his former partner tense beneath his touch. "Catch you later." Ryan gave him a slow nod. "Yeah, later." Daniel walked straight past his desk and into the records room. The basement air was thick with dust, the scent of old paper and forgotten cases settling into his lungs. The overhead lights buzzed weakly, casting sickly yellow light over rows of metal filing cabinets. If Ryan, or whoever was involved in this, thought Daniel was about to let this go, they were dead wrong. He found the archive cabinet marked Missing Persons, Juveniles, and pulled it open. He flipped through file after file, his hands moving faster as a sick feeling coiled in his gut. Then he saw it. Not just Ava's case, but others. Girls, young girls. Each case followed the same pattern, Black or Latina. Ages ranging from 13 to 16. Vanished without a trace. Each case had been closed too quickly, the reports marked with the same careless handwriting. No leads. Presumed runaway. Case closed. Daniel's breath came in short, ragged bursts. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't random. Someone had been taking these girls, and the department had helped bury it. As he flipped through the files, something fell loose. A small, folded piece of paper tucked inside a case file. His heart pounded as he unfolded it, his fingers trembling. It was a list. Names, dates, locations. But that wasn't what made Daniel's blood run cold. At the bottom of the list, scrawled in ink, were 2 words: Bright Futures. Daniel didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing. That name meant something. And whoever had written this list had been trying to hide it. He snapped photos of everything with his phone, his hands shaking with adrenaline. Then, before he could process his next move, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Daniel hesitated. His thumb hovered over the answer button, his breath catching in his throat. Finally, he pressed the call button. The voice that answered was deep, smooth, and laced with something dangerous. Detective Brooks, you should have walked away. Daniel's pulse spiked. He stood completely still, gripping the phone so hard he thought it might break. Who is this? A low chuckle. That's not important. What is important is that we know what you're doing, and we know where your ex-wife lives, where she sleeps, where she eats breakfast every morning. Daniel's vision blurred with rage. His voice came out slow, deliberate, lethal. You come near her, and I'll bury you. Another laugh. You're already buried, detective. You just don't know it yet. The line went dead. Daniel stood there, his breathing ragged, his entire body trembling with fury. They were watching him. And if they knew about his ex-wife, then they also knew about Ava. They weren't just trying to bury the truth. They were making sure he never found his daughter. The walls are closing in. Daniel sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The voice on the other end of the phone still echoed in his mind, calm, confident, and laced with a quiet menace. We know what you're doing. We know where your ex-wife lives. The message had been clear. Stop digging, or the people you love will pay the price. For the first time since seeing Ava in that car, a sliver of fear crept under his skin. Not for himself. For Lisa. For Ava. If they knew about his ex-wife, that meant they had been watching him closely, closer than he realized. His every move had been under surveillance. His phone calls, his questions, his trips to the records room. They knew. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He reached for his personal phone, not his department-issued one. The force couldn't be trusted anymore. With shaking fingers, he dialed Lisa's number. It rang once, twice. His breath caught in his throat. What if she didn't pick up? What if they had already? Daniel. Lisa's voice was groggy, thick with sleep. Relief crashed over him, but it was short-lived. Lisa, listen to me. His voice was tight, controlled, laced with urgency. Take your keys, get in your car, and go somewhere safe. Now, don't pack, don't waste time. Just go. There was a pause. What? Dan, what's going on? No questions. Just do it. Something in his tone must have hit her because Lisa suddenly inhaled sharply. Is this about Ava? Her voice wavered, a mix of fear and fragile hope. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. Yes, and it's about you too. They know where you are. Silence. Then the sound of rustling blankets, hurried movements. I'm leaving, she said. Where do I go? He thought fast. Somewhere far. Somewhere they wouldn't expect. There's a motel off Route 9. Go there. I'll find you. Dan. Her voice softened. Be careful. The line went dead. Daniel closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against the steering wheel. His heart was pounding, his pulse roaring in his ears. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. This was war. And the enemy was already inside his house. He exhaled sharply and started his car. The name that shouldn't exist. It was just past midnight when Daniel pulled into the dark alley behind Maya Jones' apartment. He killed the headlights, checking his surroundings before stepping out. The air smelled like rain, the pavement slick under his boots. Maya was waiting for him at the door, her expression tight with concern. "You're late," she said, ushering him inside quickly. "Yeah, well," Daniel muttered, closing the door behind him. "I got a phone call." Maya's apartment was small but packed with evidence of a journalist's life. Papers stacked on every surface, old coffee cups with lipstick stains, a laptop open to a page filled with frantic notes. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, red string connecting different names and dates in a chaotic web of investigation. She folded her arms. "What kind of call?" Daniel ran a hand over his face. "The kind that tells me I'm being watched. The kind that tells me I just put my ex-wife in danger." Maya's expression darkened. That fast. She sat down at her desk, typing rapidly on her laptop. "Whoever's running this has serious reach. If they're watching you this closely, they have people everywhere." "I know," Daniel said, his voice low. "Which is why we have to move now." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the slip of paper he had found buried in the files at the station. He flattened it out on Maya's desk. The name Bright Futures was scrawled at the bottom. Maya's eyes widened. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Where did you get this?" "The station archives." He leaned over her shoulder as she started typing. "Does it mean anything to you?" Maya's search results loaded. Her brow furrowed as she scrolled. Then, suddenly, she stopped. Daniel followed her gaze to the screen. The Bright Futures Youth Initiative, a non-profit organization, a charity designed to help underprivileged youth find better homes. On paper, it looked like an adoption program, something that would be praised as a force for good. The website featured smiling children, promises of a better life, and testimonials from families who had supposedly taken in kids from troubled backgrounds. It looked legitimate. Too legitimate. Daniel's stomach turned. "This is a front." Maya nodded grimly. "A good one." She scrolled further, clicking deeper into the website's history. "Look at this. Bright Futures was founded 15 years ago by Marcus Reading." Daniel stiffened. The name sent a bolt of cold through his veins. Marcus Reading. A powerful businessman. A philanthropist. A man with connections. A man who had donated millions to police charities. And now, a man whose name was tied to the same organization that had taken Ava. Daniel clenched his jaw. "I need an address." Maya clicked through several pages, navigating past layers of digital red tape. Finally, she pulled up something useful. "There's a warehouse," she said, "registered under one of Reading's shell companies. It's not on the charity's official list, but there's frequent activity. Shipments, money transfers." She met Daniel's gaze. "If this is real, if this is where they take the kids, it's where Ava might be." Daniel grabbed his gun and stood. "Then that's where I'm going." Maya shot up from her chair. "Wait. Are you insane? You can't just walk in there alone. This is bigger than one guy in a warehouse. This is organized. These people will kill you before you even make it through the front door." Daniel's hands curled into fists. "I'm not asking permission, Maya." She exhaled, rubbing her temples. "Fine, but you're not going in blind." She turned back to her laptop. "Let me see if I can get something useful first." Daniel forced himself to stay still, though every second felt like a waste of time. His blood boiled at the thought of Ava locked in some dark room, waiting for someone to save her. Waiting for him. Then Maya gasped. "Oh my God." Daniel stepped closer. "What?" Maya turned the screen toward him. It was a photo. A grainy surveillance still from inside the warehouse. A timestamp from last week. A group of kids being led through a metal hallway. Their faces blurred, their bodies thin and malnourished. And in the middle, a girl. A teenage girl with dark, curly hair, her hood pulled over her face. But Daniel knew that face. His breath hitched, his world spun, his knees nearly buckled. It was Ava. She was alive. And she was still in that place. Daniel's vision went red. His chest tightened with rage, with pure, unfiltered determination. He turned toward the door. "I'm getting her back." Maya grabbed his arm. "Daniel, stop. If you go in without a plan, you'll get yourself killed." Daniel wrenched free, his face hard, his jaw clenched. "I don't care." Because now he knew where she was, and nothing in this world was going to stop him. The hunt for Ava. The city's skyline disappeared in the rearview mirror as Daniel drove, the lights of civilization fading into the suffocating darkness of the industrial outskirts. His pulse pounded in his ears, his fingers clenched around the steering wheel so tightly they ached. The streets became narrower, the roads rougher, leading him into a part of town where streetlights barely functioned and abandoned warehouses loomed like silent tombstones. Maya had begged him to wait, to think, to plan. But there was no time. Ava was there. He had seen her, and he wasn't waiting another damn second. The warehouse was a sprawling structure, surrounded by chain-link fences topped with razor wire. The only sign of life was a single black SUV parked near the loading dock, its tinted windows reflecting the pale glow of the moon. That car, the same make and model from Mrs. Watson's report, the same kind of SUV that had been outside his house the night of the fire. His blood boiled as he pulled his car into the shadows of a shipping container, killing the engine. Ava was inside. He had no backup, no warrant, no badge that mattered anymore. Just a gun, a flashlight, and a father's unbreakable will. Daniel took a slow breath, forcing himself to think. Charging in blind was suicide. He had spent years taking down criminals, and this wasn't some two-bit drug dealer's hideout. This was an operation, a well-funded, well-organized system of trafficking that had been running for years, and they weren't going to let him walk in and take her. He moved quickly, keeping low, his boots silent against the gravel as he approached the side of the building. The windows were boarded up, the main entrance locked, but warehouses always had more than one way in. He scanned the perimeter until he spotted a rusted metal door near the rear of the building. No security cameras pointed at it. Daniel pulled out his gun, sucked in a breath, and tried the handle. Locked. He crouched, pulling a slim crowbar from his jacket pocket. With a slow, controlled motion, he wedged it into the frame and pried. The door groaned but didn't give. He pushed harder, sweat beading on his brow. The metal screamed as it finally gave way, the lock snapping under pressure. He slipped inside, the stale air thick with the scent of oil and damp concrete. Inside, the warehouse was quiet. Too quiet. A long hallway stretched before him, metal walls gleaming faintly under dim overhead lights. The air was thick with the scent of chemicals, cleaning solutions, and something else, something rotten. Daniel moved carefully, checking every doorway he passed. Most of the rooms were empty, filled with old machinery and rusted storage crates. But then, a noise, a faint shuffle, a muffled sob. Daniel's breath hitched. Ava. He followed the sound, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He came to a heavy steel door, slightly ajar. He peered through the gap, his stomach twisting at what he saw inside. Cots. Rows of them. Thin mattresses lined the floor, each one with restraints attached to the frame. The walls were bare, except for a security camera in the far corner, blinking with a tiny red light. The floor was stained with something dark, something that made Daniel's hands tremble with barely contained rage. He stepped inside, gun raised. And then, movement. A girl, curled up in the corner, her body trembling. She was young, too young. Dark, curly hair, thin arms wrapped around her knees. Daniel's throat closed up. It wasn't Ava, but she had been through hell. She flinched as he approached, her eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," he whispered, lowering his gun. "I'm here to help." She didn't speak, She just stared, unblinking, her body shaking violently. Daniel's gut twisted. How many girls had passed through this room? How many never made it out? His mind screamed for him to find Ava, but he couldn't leave the girl. "Come on," he said, extending a hand. "I'm getting you out of here." The girl hesitated. Then, slowly, cautiously, she reached out. Her fingers barely brushed his. Bang! The world exploded. Daniel was slammed backward as the door behind him burst open. A gunshot rang out, deafening in the confined space. His shoulder erupted in pain as he crashed to the ground, his gun skidding across the floor. The girl screamed, scrambling away as Daniel gasped for air, his vision swimming. Footsteps. Heavy, confident. A shadow filled the doorway. And then a voice. Low, familiar, deadly. "God damn it, Dan. You just don't know when to quit." Daniel's blood ran cold. Ryan, his former partner, stepped inside, his gun still raised, the barrel smoking. His police badge glinted under the dim light, a cruel reminder of the betrayal. Daniel gritted his teeth, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "You son of a bitch." Ryan smirked, stepping closer, his boots crunching against the dirty floor. "You always had to be the hero, didn't you? Always had to do the right thing." He kicked Daniel's gun across the room. "You never learned how this city really works." Daniel forced himself to sit up, his vision tunneling. His blood soaked into his shirt. "You were my partner." His voice was raw with fury. "You stood next to me at her funeral." Ryan's smirk faded. There was no funeral, Dan. He crouched down, leveling the gun at Daniel's chest. "There was a cover-up, and you were too broken to notice." Daniel's stomach twisted with nausea. "Why, Ryan? Why the hell would you do this?" Ryan exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Because it was bigger than me. Bigger than us." He gestured to the warehouse around them. "The system is broken, Dan. These girls, they were already lost. No one was coming for them. No one cared, except Marcus Reading. He gave them purpose." Daniel's hands curled into fists. "You're out of your goddamn mind." Ryan's jaw tightened. "You want the truth? Fine. Bright Futures isn't just some charity. It's a business. You know how much people are willing to pay for a healthy, well-behaved girl? More than you'll make in a lifetime." Daniel lunged. Ryan fired, but Daniel was already moving. The bullet whizzed past his head as he tackled Ryan, sending both of them crashing into a storage rack. The metal groaned under their weight, supplies toppling to the floor. Daniel drove his fist into Ryan's face. Ryan grunted, his head snapping back. But he recovered fast, twisting his arm and slamming an elbow into Daniel's wounded shoulder. Daniel roared in agony, nearly blacking out from the pain. Ryan shoved him off, panting. "You're too late, Dan. Even if you kill me, Reading wins. He owns the cops. He owns the politicians. He owns the city." Daniel wiped blood from his mouth. "Then I'll burn it all down." Ryan smirked. "Not if you're dead first." He raised his gun. Bang! Ryan jerked violently as a gunshot tore through his chest. He stumbled, his face contorting in shock. His weapon slipped from his fingers. He collapsed to his knees. Daniel turned and saw Ava, standing in the doorway, holding a gun. Her hands shook. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a hard line. Ryan gasped, his breath hitching. His eyes locked onto Ava, and for the first time, Daniel saw something in them. Fear. Ava's voice was steady, cold, unbreakable. "Not this time." Ryan slumped to the floor. And just like that, he was gone. Daniel's vision blurred as he turned to his daughter. "Ava." His voice cracked. She dropped the gun, and then she ran to him. Daniel caught her, pulling her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he could. She was alive, and he was never letting her go again. The final war. The night was thick with the scent of rain and blood. The warehouse was silent except for the distant hum of city life, oblivious to the war that had just erupted inside its forgotten walls. Daniel held Ava tightly against him, feeling her small frame tremble against his chest. His heart thundered in his ears, a mix of overwhelming relief and burning rage still coursing through his veins. She was here. She was alive. But the fight wasn't over. Ryan Hale's body lay slumped against the cold concrete, his once confident smirk now permanently erased by the bullet Ava had fired. The weight of what she had done settled in the air like a suffocating fog. Daniel could feel it in the way she clung to him, her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, as if letting go would make everything collapse again. "It's over," Ava whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel swallowed hard, pressing his chin against the top of her head. "No, sweetheart," he murmured. "It's just beginning." Because Marcus Reading was still out there. And Daniel Brooks wasn't stopping until the man was dead. The clock is ticking. The old motel off Route 9 was nothing more than a cheap, run-down relic from a time when travelers still passed through town looking for a place to rest. The neon sign flickered erratically, the word vacancy barely legible in the dim glow. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear. That's exactly what Daniel needed. Ava sat on the edge of the lumpy motel bed, her dark eyes staring at the peeling wallpaper, hands curled into the sleeves of the oversized hoodie he had given her. She had barely spoken since they left the warehouse. Daniel knew what was running through her mind, what she had done, the gunshot, the moment she had taken a life. "Talk to me, Ava," Daniel said softly, crouching in front of her. She blinked, her gaze finally meeting his. "I didn't hesitate," she whispered, her voice distant. "I thought I would. But I didn't." Daniel exhaled, nodding. He didn't lie to her, didn't tell her it was okay. "You did what you had to do," he said instead. "If you hadn't, I wouldn't be sitting here right now." Ava looked away, biting her lip. "It doesn't feel real." He reached out, gently squeezing her hand. "I know, but we don't have time to process it right now." He gestured to his laptop sitting on the cheap motel desk. "We need to finish this." She hesitated before shifting her focus to the screen. Maya had sent everything she had gathered. Bank statements, government contracts, names. It was worse than they had thought. Marcus Reading wasn't just trafficking children. He was selling them to the highest bidder. Corporations, foreign dignitaries, politicians, people with power. Daniel's stomach churned as he scrolled through the evidence. Names of missing girls paired with dates, transaction amounts listed in cold, detached numbers, a ledger of lives stolen. Ava's breath hitched beside him. She pointed to a name near the bottom of the list. Layla Carter. Daniel's grip on the mouse tightened. "You knew her." Ava nodded slowly, her hands balling into fists. "She tried to escape once. They made an example out of her." Daniel didn't need to ask what that meant. He closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. How many more Laylas had there been? "We have enough to bring this down," Ava whispered. "To end it." Daniel's jaw clenched. She still believed in the system. He didn't. Bringing this to the police wasn't an option. Too many were compromised. And the FBI, even if they weren't in Reading's pocket, the justice system moved slowly. A trial, appeals, deals being made behind closed doors. Reading would walk. Daniel wasn't going to let that happen. "I'm not handing this over," he said firmly. Ava frowned. "But I'm going to kill them." Her eyes widened. "Dad, this isn't a case, Ava." He cut in, his voice cold, steady. "This is war. If we don't end him, he will keep going. He will rebuild. He will find another Ryan Hale to cover for him. He will find more girls." Ava's lips trembled, but she didn't argue, because she knew he was right. Daniel grabbed his gun and checked the magazine. "Maya sent me his location. He's holed up in a private estate outside the city, preparing to run." He met his daughter's gaze. "I'm going tonight." Ava swallowed. Then, softly, "I'm coming with you." Daniel shook his head immediately. "No, you stay here." Ava's chin lifted, stubborn, defiant. "You need me." He wanted to tell her no. He wanted to tell her she had already been through enough, that she deserved to stay out of the fire. But Ava wasn't a little girl anymore, and she had earned her vengeance. After a long silence, Daniel sighed. "Stay close to me." She nodded, her fingers curling around the stolen gun at her side. The last stand. Marcus Reading's estate was a fortress, a high-tech security system, guards patrolling the perimeter. The driveway alone was long enough to make an escape nearly impossible. He had prepared for an attack, but Daniel wasn't coming in through the front door. Crouched behind the tree line, Daniel and Ava moved like shadows. The rain had picked up, the scent of wet earth filling the air. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Daniel took out a pair of bolt cutters. With slow, careful movements, he sliced through the fence. One wire, then another. Ava slipped through first, Daniel right behind her. They moved quickly, staying low. A guard stood near the back entrance. Daniel moved fast, silent. One sharp blow to the back of the head, and the man dropped. Ava barely flinched. The door was unlocked. Daniel's gut twisted. This was too easy. They slipped inside. The hallway was empty, the house too quiet. Then, a voice. Calm, smooth, confident. "Ah, Detective Brooks." Daniel froze. Marcus Reading stood at the top of the grand staircase, a glass of wine in one hand, a pistol in the other. Beside him, two guards raised their weapons. Reading smiled. "I was wondering when you'd come." Daniel's fingers tightened on his gun. "I know what you did," he growled. Reading sighed dramatically, sipping his wine. "Of course you do. And yet, here you are, still playing the noble cop. What's your plan, Daniel? Kill me? Walk out of here a murderer?" Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger. "You don't deserve a trial." Reading's smirk widened. "Then do it." Ava stepped forward. "You ruined my life." Reading's smirk faltered. Ava lifted her gun. No hesitation this time. And she fired. One bullet. Straight through Marcus Reading's forehead. He didn't have time to react. His eyes went wide. He crumpled to the floor. His guards hesitated. Daniel took the moment to shoot them both. Then, silence. Ava stood over Reading's body, her chest rising and falling in deep, measured breaths. It was over. Finally, Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. She turned to him. And for the first time in 3 years, she smiled. Epilogue. The fire is out. They didn't stay in the city. Ava needed a fresh start. So did Daniel. Somewhere, in another town, in another life. Ava Brooks started over. And the monsters were finally gone. Forever.